want to thank everybody for coming out. It's a wonderful crowd. It's not freezing out, so it's a little bit easier to get around. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and having this all set up. But I'm going to dive right in, right? So I'll give a presentation. I've added things for just our historical and political moment, which will give you a vision of what the Key Center is doing today, right, in response to the administration. So we're going to look at historically, and then we're going to end up looking in a very contemporaneous way of what's happening at the center as we speak. Okay, is that better? And keep policing me if it sort of fades out. It's sort of hard to have a handheld and then try to do all of the other stuff. But this is the history of structural racism in Metro Detroit. But I'm going to say that we've got to be united. Right? So you're going to see the history of division, but at the end of it, in this historical moment, we really have to talk about how we can get a unity, right? But this backdrop, I think, is necessary for us to think about the challenges that we're going to have in trying to get regional unity. I always like to give a shout out to Judge Keith, his biography, Crusader for Justice, one of the greatest jurists this country has ever produced, and the namesake of our center. But the claim I want to make is that the name George Floyd and countless others has come to symbolize the cumulative effects of 400 years of racism, right? We face a dual pandemic, right? We have a pandemic of police brutality, but we also have a pandemic of racially disparate impacts in health, wealth, and opportunity. And I never thought that my presentation might be illegal, but maybe we're getting close to the line. These pandemics are interrelated. Disparities in health, wealth, and opportunity lie at the intersection of structural racism and policies of fiscal austerity. Police brutality lies at the intersection of structural racism and various forms of militarism. But schools don't teach about it. I love the fact that we have educators here, right? This is critical, and yet we don't have the tools conceptually or analytically to actually deal with this. And now we can't even talk about it in a number of schools, right? So we're going to give you a little bit of structural racism 101. And the thing we're going to do is have a lot of sort of playing around with that notion of what we see, what we don't see, right? But racism and structural racism, when you start to learn how to see it correctly, is all around us, right? It's hiding in plain sight. And you can think about The Invisible Man and Ralph Ellison, sort of this theme going back in literature and elsewhere. But it's not equal, right? European Americans like myself are trained and socialized not to see the racism that surrounds us, right? And there's a wonderful notion that I draw from Charles Mills, who was a political philosopher, called the epistemology of ignorance. Right? And epistemology, of course, is a fancy name for theory of knowledge. And for a lot of work, we have to have a theory of knowledge. But to really understand the way that racism works in America, you also have to have a theory of ignorance, right? Or what Charles Mills calls white ignorance, that we're socialized not to see this, right? And so we've got to sort of look at this and think about new ways to see it, but also the new ways to teach people how to be seeing it. Conversely, if you think about Americans of color, they confront and experience racism every day of their lives, right? It's not hiding anywhere. It's not invisible. And there's a quote in the biography, and Judge Keith would say this often, that there was not a day in his life that in some way, great or small, he was not reminded that he was a black man in America. Right? And as I said before, this is one of the greatest jurists this country has ever produced. Well, some of the implications of that. One implication for European Americans is a lifelong process of unlearning what we have been taught and relearning how to see again, right? And everybody's at different places of that journey. Everybody can take that journey, right? It's not an exclusive process. Conversely, the knowledge, right, the experience of Americans of color need to be centered, honored, and respected, right? If you want to understand races, we got to understand the people who know about racism and learn from them. There's a joke I sometimes say, if you wanted to build a bridge, right, you wouldn't go to a civil engineer that didn't see gravity, right? Just the same way, if you want to end structural racism, you don't go to somebody who doesn't see color, right? We've got to start thinking about these things in new terms. And again, lots of resources. I mentioned Charles Mills' book, The Racial Contract. There's The Invisible Man. If you haven't read it, you should read it. If you've read it before, you should read it again, right? And I think particularly in these times, these are important resources. But I want to start with an illustration, right? Do we see and understand the dynamics of what we call spatial racism that define every aspect of Metro Detroit, right? And to do this, I want to sort of go one step back so we can take two steps forward, right? So this is sort of a framing to get you sort of in the right cognitive frame in order to think about this in a perhaps slightly different way. And one of my favorite questions is to ask, what if people were gas molecules, right? We got some educators here. If this was a high school class, people would be jumping up and down wanting to answer it. But what would happen if I brought all sorts of gases into the room, different gases, right, in a short period of time? Yeah, they disperse evenly, right? So in a short period of time, no matter where I'm sampling, I'm getting the same distribution of gas molecules, right? And yet we know that people don't act like gas molecules, right? People are segregated, right? Then we have to sort of ask the big why questions. Well, what is the social, the economic, the political, and often the physically violent forces historically that have shaped these demographic patterns, right? That keep us not acting like gas molecules. And I like to give people things that they can take away, right? And this is a mantra we use at the Key Center, use it in my teaching. Think about the spatialization of race and the racialization of space, right? The spatialization of race and the racialization of space, right? And if you drive around Southeast Michigan and Metro Detroit, you see that physically represented where you go, right? You want to start thinking about how these things are intertwined historically, how they affect our lives today, because at the end, it's that cumulative effect of racism is not just sort of these one-offs that happens in terms of particular incidences. And when you start getting in this mindset, right, you start to realize that the past didn't go anywhere. And if you start to see differently in new ways, you start to find what I call archaeological evidence of spatial structural racism, right? And it's everywhere, right? I said, once you see it, once you learn how to see it, you see it everywhere. If you're socialized in the epistemology of ignorance, you drive right by it, right? You're not even aware of it, right? So that's the framework I want to see us using as we, and again, resources. There's a great book by James Lowen on sundown towns, right? You'll find sundown towns throughout Michigan. You may live in a sundown town and not know it. And if you do know it, you want to teach your neighbors, right? This is not knowledge that you want to have hidden. How racism takes place from Gerald Lipset is who I stole that mantra from about the racialization of space and the spatialization of race, and I don't know who George stole it from, right? All right, so the exercise here, the application, is going to be looking at spatial racism in Southeast Michigan, and we're going to do it through a pretty simple tool called opportunity mapping, right? And opportunity means exactly what you think it means. It's the quality of housing, right? It's whether or not you can get a good job. It's whether or not you can have high quality schools. It's whether or not you have access to public and private health care. Whether you have access to public or private transportation. You know, something you would never think you have to say in America, whether you have food security, right? Whether you have access to affordable, healthy, nutritious food, and what's the quality of living environment, right? And again, I sometimes joke that American is great in part because we have professionals for everything, right? And we have opportunity professionals, right? And you actually have to take a state license, right, and pass it, and have a state exam and be registered as an opportunity professional. You know what we call these people? Real estate license, right? And real estate license can tell you exactly where opportunity is. And if you have enough money in America, you can be steered, and I'm using that word very consciously, to opportunity. And if you don't have enough money, you're going to be steered to areas of lower opportunity. All right, so I want you to go through this exercise with me. Imagine that you're out in the sort of space station up there, and imagine that you're looking down at Southeast Michigan, and imagine that all you can see is either the presence or absence of opportunity. Right? And we're going to paint areas of high opportunity in dark, rich colors. And you can just think about the Tri-County area, right? And you've lived in this area for a while. So paint the areas of high opportunity in dark, rich colors, and then think about areas of low opportunity and paint them in kind of light, pale colors, right? And if you're up in outer space and you're looking down at Southeast Michigan, this is the map that the Michigan Roundtable commissioned from the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University. And this is what opportunity looks like in Southeast Michigan. All right, we can get the booze out, you know. This is opportunity in the 7-county SEBCOG area. So you get sort of a big, ugly 7-county map. I want to situate this for you so you can start to think about it locally. If you were in outer space, then you could see this opportunity desert, right? But this opportunity desert has a geopolitical name, and once we name it, it's going to situate the map, right? So what's the name of this opportunity desert? Pontiac, right? And now we have one of my favorite why questions again. Well, why do I have an opportunity desert surrounded by a sea of opportunity, right? And indeed, Oakland County historically has been one of the richest counties in the United States, right? And then you can kind of come down and you see the demarcation of 8 Mile almost as a shifting of different kinds of opportunity, although over time that has shifted a little bit north. And does that mean there's no opportunity in Wayne County? No, we're covering right over the Grosse Points, right? Areas of high opportunity, right? So we have here clearly the segregation of wealth and opportunity in Southeast Michigan, right? The next slide is going to overlay racial demographics. You're going to see green dots, and the green dots will represent predominant census tracts of African American populations. And it's a story in black and white, and that's how they did it. I always acknowledge the fact there's a lot of people that aren't represented on this map, right? And that's just a reality of how they used the methodology. But at this point, I want to sort of, again, stop and say, think about the American mind, right? The American mind looks at individuals and not systems, right? But this is a story about systems and not individuals, right? And that's important enough, we're going to say it again. This is a story about systems and not individuals. To create opportunity, I need very elaborate systems, economic systems, social systems, political systems. So what I'm really measuring with these maps is either the investment or relative disinvestment in the infrastructure that's necessary to create opportunity, right? And you have to be in that mindset if you're going to understand and really appreciate the next map, right? So we're going to overlay racial demographics, and this is what we get, right? And I'm just going to toggle that back and forth a little bit, right? I'm glad that people are reacting to it in the way that you should, right? So I not only have here the segregation of wealth and opportunity, I have very clearly the segregation of race, wealth, and opportunity, and that's what we call spatial racism. Right? So what is spatial racism? It's the segregation of race, wealth, and opportunity, and that's a defining characteristic of Southeast Michigan. And indeed, in some ways, Southeast Michigan is ground zero for spatial racism. Right? And then we're going to have to guess again why, and that will be part of the rest of the presentation. And I felt a little bit guilty because this map is getting old, right? And so these are two newer maps from a different author. So Raj Chetty, who's now at Harvard, does these big data studies, and he looked at social mobility, and this is actually a national map, so you can look at it across the nation, then you can zero down into your own locality. This is a story of whether or not you can do better than your parents, right? The red areas, you're not doing better than your parents. The kind of bluish-green areas, you are likely to do better than your parents. So we see, again, that kind of spatial racism represented modern, new data about social mobility. Raj Chetty did the same thing with access to social capital, and I think you see the pattern developing, right? That spatial racism is real, it's not going anywhere, and if you look at these maps about not doing as well as your parents, it relatively is likely to get worse in the future and not better, and this was before the last election, right? Those are the resources, and I'm happy to make these slides available, right? If you want to have a copy, just email me. You can find my email if you just Google, and the algorithm puts me at the top because I teach at a university, right? All right, so my claim is that map, right, spatial racism, impacts every social policy issue you can care about, every one, right? Whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's municipal distress, when you talk about Judge Rosen, police brutality, whether it's talking about water shutoffs or tax foreclosures or childhood obesity or childhood asthma or emergency management or infant mortality or environmental racism, it's everywhere, right? And yet, how many people have seen a map like that before, right? Again, what do we see, what do we not see? And I always also tell my students, when you don't know something, it's not individual blame. That's another part of the American psyche. That is, if you don't know something, it's your own fault, right? Knowledge is socially constructed, right? So if you don't know it, right, why weren't you taught it, right? If you haven't seen this map, why aren't they showing it to you? Especially if the premise that I'm saying is true, that this map has to be seen to understand the dynamics that produce these underlying social issues, and that it's not in the Free Press, it's not in the Detroit News, it's not in the Evening News. We're back to that sort of another illustration of that epistemology of ignorance, right? That we're taught not to know these things, and indeed, Charles Mills would say if we were taught about them, we couldn't sustain them, right? If we have knowledge, we couldn't be racist, right? If we're ignorant, right, we can perpetuate these cycles, right? All right, so how did we get here, right? From the 1920s to the 1950s, segregation existed largely inside of neighborhoods in Detroit, right? From the 1960s to the present, we've gone through this process of regional resegregation where entire cities now, like Detroit and Pontiac that we saw, function as racialized spaces, right? The sort of basis of spatial racism. And think about what affects everything, right? Sort of imagine what that means for education and access to education. And who has the opportunity to get the skills that are necessary to be successful in this country, and who are excluded of that by the geography, by the zip code in which you're born into, not anything dealing with about your aptitude. All right. Goes back in part, it goes back longer than redlining, but we can sort of start the story of redlining. And I'm sure most of you are sort of vaguely familiar with this notion, that the federal policy, when they created these 30-year loans, which were magic, right? They didn't exist. You had to have all the money up front or get into these crazy financing situations to buy a house until the Federal Housing Authority created these maps, or created these loans, right? but the loans were intentionally, right, intentionally written not to be available if you were not a white person, right? And not only that, you had to be a white person living in a white neighborhood. And another sort of fact is racism needs a bureaucracy, an administrative system. So how am I going to enforce that? Well, I got to get the banks involved, right? So the banks then made these maps, right, about where the black people were living, where the safe white people were living, and it's called these redlining maps, right? They sort of now become infamous, sort of describing the history of intentional racism in housing, right? And we're going to come back to the implications of that, the importance of not being able to buy a house in the 1930s or 1940s on your current wealth status, right? Because these things don't go away. It's the cumulative effect. It's the cumulative effect. It's the cumulative effect you got to start seeing and then linking and connecting the dots. So I'm going to tell 2 stories. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I want to get to some materials about what we're doing today, right? And again, this reinforces what you already know. I bet I haven't said anything about Southeast Michigan that you didn't already know coming in, right? Might help you frame it, might help you interpret it, but this is inside of you, right? We have this knowledge. We've got to bring it out. We've got to see it, right? We can't hide it. So I'm going to show you maps about the progression of spatial racism inside the city, and I'm going to do the same set of maps in the region. So 1930s census tracts, darker green colors, are predominantly African-American neighborhoods. You start to see, and this is with the Great Migration, just imagine the influx of people, and imagine sort of keeping them contained again. In fact, we're trying to make them not act like gas molecules. We're going to keep the segregation going. So 1930s, 1940s, 1950s sort of start to start breaking out. 1960s already broken, right? Substantially, right? And one of the reasons it's broken because of the freeways, right? The freeways came in and displaced people and then threw them to the wind with no relocation, and they start to have to enter neighborhoods that they were not living in before, right? 1970, 1980, 1990s, 2000, you start the Southwest Latino community starts to grow, but you see again this sort of complete change in the demography over a 60-year period. I'm going to do the same thing at the regional level, but one thing to observe is how balkanized we are, right? We have more little cities and little municipalities than almost anywhere else in the country, right? And that is part of the physics that enables the facilitation of regional resegregation and the existence of spatial racism today, right? This is a map just showing metro growth, and it shows that, go back far enough, there was no Bloomfield Township, right? It certainly didn't have an amazing public good, which is a library that we're all benefiting from and utilizing today. But same maps that we're going to start in the 1950s. So this is the same map you saw in Detroit, but now we're going to look at it at a regional level, right? And I want you to pay attention to 2 things, the kind of shaping of the yellow, which is sort of white space, green, which is black space, but also look at the roads, right? I need infrastructures to have opportunity. So the roads are sort of a proxy then of the expansion of the region, the growth, but also then the facility, the infrastructure that's necessary to facilitate the white flight. So 1950s, 1960s, right, 1970s, look at those roads. So those roads are getting built. And that's public funds, right, again, sort of this notion of who's subsidizing the white flight. 1990s, right, and you sort of merge then into 2000. And the point is this kind of question, we have regional resegregation, segregation inside the city, and then we have segregation at a regional level, but still maintaining of segregated spaces, right, and still sort of building and maintaining those notions of spatial racism. Right? So we're now going to straight to the deeper why questions. Right? What's driving these things? What's enabling these things to take place? And I'm going to sort of have 3 sort of areas that we're going to go through. One is this claim that we need more sophisticated understandings of the way that race and racism functions in this country. Right? Secondly, we need better understandings of the dynamic production and reproduction of racism. Racism is not static, right? It's constantly changing at a structural level. And we're going to do that through a simple dialectic between belief systems and institutions, right? And then finally, we're going to talk about what the Key Center is doing today, right? And as we're trying to help build an inclusive multiracial democracy, right? Until they put us out of business, right? And that's not a joke. Right? Again, resources, right? Racing to Justice by John Powell, a wonderful book on structural racism, right? And John is a Detroit native, right? So a great export from the city. How to be an anti-racist, sort of Ibram X. Kendi. There's a lot of good resources to try to take this and go deeper and further with some of these lessons. So the first claim is that we need more sophisticated understandings of the way that race and racism functions, right? And if we ask most Americans what is racism, most of them would talk about express or intentional forms of discrimination, right? That exists. We have to be vigilant about that. That is more intense now than any time in my lifetime, right? This is something I think we all hoped would sort of go away, but it's not. So we have to recognize, yes, that is there. That's always been there. And it is still there, and it's getting worse, right? But it's not the only form of racism. If we go down to one of the lower quadrants, we have implicit bias, right? And there's all sorts of great cognitive research and cognitive psychology in the last 3 decades that really try to explore how racism functions in the brain, right? And I always tell my students, we want to have knowledge to enable strategic action, right? We want to have knowledge to enable strategic action. So the hope is, if we better understand the way that racism gets implanted in us and gets reproduced intergenerationally, how can we start to maybe intervene, right? The bad news is the stuff we're trying doesn't work very well, right? So just telling somebody about implicit bias doesn't change anything, right? But we got to understand better sort of the cognitive component, right? On the other quadrant, we have structural racism, right? And I've been a very bad teacher. I've used that word and I haven't defined it. So let's define it, all right? At the Key Center, we talk about structural racism as the inter-institutional dynamics that produce and reproduce racially disparate outcomes over time. Again, it's got to be a dynamic theory. But I'll give you an illustration, and then we'll repeat the definition so you can sort of start wrestling with that in your own mind and hopefully retain that when you're leaving this room. So, racially disparate outcomes, right? And one of the biggest racially disparate outcomes is household wealth, right? So think about the average black family and the average white family. Think about the wealth they have, right? And a spoiler alert, the average white family has more wealth, right? And the question then is how much more wealth, right? And who wants to guess? How much more wealth does the average white family? And if you, this is a game where if you know the answer, sit on your hands, right? We're exploring white ignorance throughout this, right? So how much more wealth does the white family have over the black family? I heard that you said 50%? Yeah, I love that answer for 2 reasons, right? Because it always happens, right? It's not right, I don't want to, but I'm not, there's no shame, because if you don't know, you weren't taught, right? That's the whole point. This knowledge is socially productive. So why don't you know this? What are the forces that didn't teach you this? Why isn't this in the newspaper? Why isn't this part of policy discussions, right? But I also love, because we have to worry about cognitive frames, right? So the cognitive frame implicit in 50% is what? That it can't be more than 100%. Right? And again, it's a nice reminder. That's why I love when I get that answer. It's a nice reminder that we have all sorts of cognitive frames that we're operating under that we're not even aware, and yet they control our thinking. Right? So now we're going to blow through that limit. It can be more than 100%, and indeed it is more than 100%. So the real question is, how many more times, right, in terms of wealth does a white family have over a black family? All right. We got 3, right? It's higher than 3. You have 10. We're getting close, right? And it depends how you do the data, right? And always interrogate data. Don't accept anything I say on face value, right? We've got to be critical thinkers. We can't just believe everything that we're told. But the data depends how you go. It can be anywhere from 10 to 13 times more wealth, right? But the average white family has between 10 and 13 times more wealth, right? And if you didn't know that, first ask who the hell didn't teach you, right? And secondly, I hope you're hitting it at an emotional level and not just an intellectual level. I hope that kind of feels a little bit like somebody just hit you in the stomach, right? And then we have the why question, right? What is the inter-institutional dynamics, which is a fancy way of saying how did the housing sector intersect with the education sector, intersect with the job sector, intersect with the transportation sector to produce that racially disparate outcome, and more importantly, to reproduce it over time, dynamically, right? And go back to that redlining map, right? If you couldn't buy a house in the 1930s, you didn't build the intergenerational wealth. So indeed, housing becomes one of those important parts of it. And what did we say? That was an intentional government decision, right? And we can go farther into how, a wonderful book, Ira Katznelson, I don't have a slide, When Affirmative Action Was White, right? And it's a book about how the New Deal was racialized, right? And how all the New Deal programming was making sure that it was directed towards white folks and not people of color, right? All right, so that's structural racism. You gotta be honest, right? You have to say, well, what drives the system, right? All systems have architectures, all systems have a hydrology, all systems have something that is making it run, right? And the answer here is in the middle, white supremacy. Right? This happens because of a history and the cumulative impact of white supremacy. Right? 10 years ago, I'd have to sort of drill deeper into that. Right? I think we see it now more obviously. Right? But I would sort of go back to say in the old days, when people had to sort of wrestle with white supremacy because they didn't see it, on the TV news, nobody could deny, right, that slavery was about white supremacy, right? And even back then, people would have to nod, right? Okay, got to concede that. Then you say, well, I don't think anybody can deny that Jim Crow was about white supremacy, right? And again, people have to sort of nod. And I say, well, that was only 60 years ago, right? And then I have to sort of leave in the air, where did it go, right? Where did it go? And we all know where it went, right? It didn't go anywhere, right? And we'll come back to that theme in a little bit, right? But the bottom line from this slide is I have one slide. We can talk about this for hours. One slide, you could take that home, you can draw it on a napkin, and you have the tools that are necessary to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the way the race and racism functions, right? And that's what we need. So that's one of the things that we need. The next thing we need is to get this understanding to be more dynamic, right? How do we understand this as a process through history where the same sort of forces are driving it even as they mutate and change over time? And to do this, we have a simple dialectic we use, which is a dialectic between belief systems and institutions, right? And belief systems are the kind of myths, the norms of the beliefs, the mythology that we have that governs our society, right? And myths are real, right? And another joke I have is, where do you find mythology in America, right? Well, churches, part, I agree with that, but your high school history class, right? The best way that we create mythology in America is by what is taught in high school history classes, and that forms that belief system that we've been talking about. Then we have institutions. Institutions are the rules, the law, the norms that govern society, right? And a Nobel Prize-winning economic historian, Douglas North, sort of gives us this intuition. We can think about the belief systems as the internal manifestations of the external institutions. And we think about the external institutions as the external manifestation of the internal belief systems, right? Beliefs define institutions, institutions come back and reinforce belief systems, right? And that starts to help us get this sort of notion about how this dynamic understanding of racism works, right? Again, we're going to take one step back, sort of this cognitive framing slide, in order to take two steps forward, right? So I would claim that two common myths, particularly of Western origin, is that time is linear, right, and that race is marginal, right? Now, what are the implications? So time is, we have this view of history as a big straight line, right? The past is way, way over there, and the future is somewhere in the other direction. In America, we have a myth of progress, so we sort of tilt that line that things are always getting better, right? That's looking at history as a linear. And it's how we do our textbooks, it's how we do our museums, right? That's sort of how we define history. And what are we doing about sort of race is marginal. Race is not important, right? Race is not central, right? What happens when I combine these two systems, we get the following implications in a minute. The implications are that past injustices can be ignored, right? What happens when you bring up slavery? Well, that's a long time ago, right? Get over it, right? Problems then can solve themselves, right? We just wait enough with a myth of progress, we don't have to take actions. So problems of racial justice are not important. They will take care of themselves, right? We don't have to have any action to be taken, right? That is obviously not consistent with the view that racism is cumulative, right? That racism compounds itself over time, that racism is dynamic, right? So if we have a new frame, right, we sort of flip those two myths that we started with, is linearity the only way I can think about time? Right? How else might I think about time? Yeah, we got it over there. Time is cyclical. And indeed, for most of human history, based on an agricultural economy, we thought of time as cyclical, right? In a lot of other countries that still have a predominantly agricultural base, they still think time is cyclical, right? So the idea that time is linear is actually a fairly recent phenomenon in human history, right? So imagine if we flip both of those, think about that. If time is cyclical, where's the past? Right? In one respect, it's not a meaningful question, right? In another respect, yeah, the past is behind me, but the past is also ahead of me, right? And the path is with me now, right? So it's a radically different understanding about the notion of the past, right? So now if I flip both of those myths and I start thinking about time is cyclical and race is central. Race is just right in the middle. Time is cyclical, race is central, right? Now we're primed to be thinking about the social production and reproduction of racially disparate outcomes, right? So that sort of fits into our definition of structural racism. So what does that mean then? And we're going to take sort of a train ride through history, right? And thinking how we get from slavery to Jim Crow to spatial racism. Right? And the first one is why we suggested people sort of get, right? Slavery might have been ended by the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? But it didn't change the racialized belief systems and attitudes, right? And the racialized belief systems and attitudes, institutions can be mutated all sorts of different ways. It's like silly putty, like building blocks. So I can imagine the same racialized attitudes not reverting back to slavery, but reverting forward into forms of Jim Crow segregation, right? Same belief system, new institutional structure, same pattern of racial domination, right? Harder question for most folks is to try to think about how I get from spatial racism to Jim Crow into spatial racism, right? And there's an old adage, and some of you may know it, right? It sort of helps you build the intuition for the last part of the train trip. The old adage is that in the South, you can be close, right? But you can't be equal. And a lot of the historic relationships were fairly intimate, right? You could be close, but you couldn't be equal. In the North, we don't like to think we discriminate, right? So you can be equal, but you cannot be close, right? So discrimination historically in the North has had a very strong geographic component, right? And if anybody goes back to the old footage about Martin Luther King going to Cicero, Illinois to desegregate, he said the hatred he saw there was more intense and more real over housing, over geography, than anything he experienced in Jim Crow, right? And you look at the news today, right? You see that same hatred, right? That comes from sort of 0 to 60, right? Just right out in there, right? It's in us white people, right? It never went away, right? And now as we go from slavery to Jim Crow to spatial racism to our current politics, it's all the same thing, right? Racialized belief systems fighting over the structure of institutions. And as I said before, we are ground zero for that struggle in Metro Detroit, right? That gives us the maps of spatial structural racism that we saw, right? All right, so deep breath, that's a lot, right? A lot of history, a lot of thinking. So let yourself process a bit, all right? And then we're gonna actually transition into what the Key Center is doing today, right? And give you kind of a window into how we're trying to imagine responding as a civil rights center to the new administration. All right, journey continues, right? So, you know, the whole goal of America, I used to think, was a story about trying to build an inclusive multiracial democracy, right? And we got closest to that probably with the election of Barack Obama, right? The first African-American president, right? And that becomes the trigger of the backlash, right? And you have to view the current situation here as part of that dynamic pattern of backlash, right? So we had abolition, right? And the backlash to that was the Civil War, right? Succession, right? We had the Civil War, and then we had Reconstruction, right? The backlash to Reconstruction was that whole period of redemption that produced Jim Crow, right? We had the Civil Rights Movement, the first Civil Rights Movement, and the backlash to that was really sort of all taken out over busing, right? And affirmative action, right? And trying to reassert sort of the old system, right? Action, reaction, progress, backlash, right? So in many ways what we're seeing in today's politics is a backlash against the closest we have ever gotten to an inclusive multiracial democracy, right? And you can go back and you see the backlashes have so much in common, right? And we're seeing that today. It's privatized violence, right? It is a complete reassertion of a racial hierarchy, right? It is a complete vilification and othering of the other, right? Whether that's the immigrant, whether that's the African American, right? So I think that gives you a much better framing to let you see, back to seeing again, what's actually happening around us and why it's so dangerous, right? There's a line from Dr. King's book, Chaos or Community, and I'm paraphrasing that. He talked about segregationists, but he was talking about people, he talked about white supremacy. He says white supremacists would rather have a native fascism than equality, right? So white supremacists would rather have a native fascism than equality, right? And that's just a truism throughout our history, all right? So what can we do about it, right? We talked, this was a story about division. We gotta create a story about unity, right? And we gotta figure out how the Tri-County area and beyond can respond and mitigate the sort of threatened rise of authoritarianism and abuses of federal power, right? And it can. Local governments have power in a federal system. There's a whole lot of things local governments can do if they don't give it away. that can fight against it, right? And especially if I'm looking at Detroit, as the Keith Center does, this is a local election, right? So the politics of making very clear as a central issue, what are you as a candidate going to do to safeguard your citizens from the abuse of federal power has got to be, in my mind, the top issue that's got to be addressed in the Detroit election, and by extension, every other local election that is going to be coming up throughout the state and throughout the nation. So about 3 years ago, we just started to say structural racism is real. We've done a great analysis of it. We still are going to be looking at the issues affecting the region through that lens, but it doesn't get us out of it, right? So how do we get out of it? It's actually democracy. So we were starting 3 years ago to start the beginning groundwork for the Detroit Democracy Project, right? And a year and a half ago, we went through a community-engaged design process, have this nice concept paper, piloted out 2 interesting pilots last fall. One of them was cultivating democracy through conversation, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then you have the elections, right? So now you not only have to try to build democracy, you have to fight against authoritarianism, right? And I say, what does that look like? And one thing that looks like is what I'll talk about in a minute, called the Beacon Project that we're starting, right? So break that apart in a little bit. I'm just sort of giving you a high-level overview, right? We can talk more later if you're interested. We can talk about how you might be able to collaborate with some of the work, because we need coalitions. We can't work in our silos. So if you go to detroitdemocracy.org, you will find Cultivating Democracy Through Conversations, right? And the notion here was we were targeting people who have never voted before. And not only had they never voted before, they had very legitimate reasons why politics had never done anything for them, right? And so we thought that, well, we got to just get people talking, right? So if you go to this site, you can register, you can download discussion guides, and you made a commitment to having conversations with your friends and families, right? This is very relational, right? Talk to people you know, right? And there's a discussion guide about democracy, right? We found out that people don't care about democracy. It's too abstract, right? And again, it's against a backdrop that hasn't worked. It's not working, hasn't worked. I don't need democracy. But people really did care about power, right? They knew if you wanted to get things done, you had to have power, right? And so there's a discussion guide about power and how power operates, right? And how you can create power, which in part is through democracy. So you sort of start connecting some of these ideas. And the third discussion guide that you can find is about solidarity, right? What does solidarity mean? How do you practice solidarity? How can you think about building coalitions between different groups? And we had to add one so we didn't look completely obtuse about how can you process the results of the last election, right? And we added that shortly after the election. But again, you can look at that. I still think these tools are real. I think we have to have conversations. We have to have probably different ones. I think this probably already feels a bit stale, right, about this not being the most important issue we have to talk about. And so in addition to trying to build democracy, we also have to fight authoritarianism. Yeah, DetroitDemocracyProject.org. Yeah, no, we got to get the news out. And there's a feedback mechanism. So you can actually go to a forum and tell us what you're learning. All right? So the whole point is that we're trying not to have this just all go into the ether, although it's important to sort of go out there and be decentralized. But we want to try to capture and understand what people are learning in the conversations. Right? And we will create new discussion guides, right, that will be more timely to try to think about, like a discussion guide on what municipalities can do to fight against the federal government. Right? And those will be coming out over time. And we're trying to build our social media presence. So, email me and I can get you in touch with our social media people. I never thought I'd be saying this in my life, but we are on Facebook, we are on Instagram, because we got to communicate. We're not on X, right? Blue Sky we got shout out for. I'm not sure. I know we have to do it, but I'm not the one that has to do it. So we have a good team. But we're trying to build it because we want to be able to communicate with people, right? And I'll sort of tell you what we think our lanes are that we can actually contribute in ways that are complementary and not duplicating the good work of a group like the League of Women Voters, right? So that's DetroitDemocracy.org. That's Cultivating Democracy Through Conversation. But we also have to start educating people about authoritarianism, right? We got to understand our current political moment. And these are sort of standard things that authoritarians have done throughout time, right? And are doing today comparatively, sort of thinking about other countries. One thing you have to do is destroy truth, right? There can't be truth, right? Authoritarianism can't live in a world where there's truth. And there's another kind of nice framing. I'm forgetting the Hungarian academic's name, but he was trying to figure out, what was happening in his own country. And he talks about the first stage is attempted autocracy, right? It's sort of autocratic attempt, right? And you can really think about the first Bush or the first Trump administration as the autocratic attempt, right? All the way up to the very last minutes, right? That didn't succeed, right? The second stage is an autocratic breakthrough, right? And I think that's what we're experiencing now, right? We're just going to break through everything. We're going to start acting like an authoritarian. And the third stage is the consolidation of authoritarianism, right? And that's contestable in this country, right? And that's why I say if we're united and if we're fighting, we can potentially prevent the consolidation of an authoritarian state, right? But one thing I got to get rid of truth. There can't be truth, and we sort of have got that whole thing. The whole notion about who won the 2020 election is really an attack on truth, right? There aren't real historical facts, even if you have real historical evidence. And if I can believe that, or if I can tell you that, I can tell you anything, right? And there's actually a long history in this country of sort of anti-Enlightenment thinking, right? And so again, a lot of this is not new, right? Where sort of truth is what the people think, right? Truth is what feels true, right? Truth is not what I'm going to find through the scientific method. Right? It's all together. But when you can start to piece that together now, you can start to see from your own memory, your own recollection, how these things have already started to happen, right? And how far they have advanced, right? So got to get rid of truth. I got to upside down expertise, right? So I attack the universities, right? You look at the people who are getting appointed to cabinet positions, right? Is really an attack on expertise, right? Because if there's expertise, I have limits, right? I have to have a policy matter that is consistent with science, right? I have to worry about climate change, right? If there is no expertise, or if whatever I say is the creation of the expertise, I can do anything. There are no limits, right? I got to get rid of the courts, right? Can't be told what to do. Can't be judged by an external standard, right? In the first administration, have a lot of appointees, right? They have the Supreme Court. The pushback that you're seeing now is from district courts, right? And very few appellate court decisions so far. But if I'm going to be an authoritarian, I have to get rid of the courts, have to break down checks and balances, have to get rid of the rule of law. What replaces it is really a mafia state, right? And there it is all corruption. Right? It's all about power and all about corruption. You get spoils by being loyal, right? And it has nothing to do with meritocracy, despite what they're telling us, right? It has to do with loyalty, has to do with connections and networks, and is run more like a mafia state than it is anything resembling a democracy. I've got to attack my political rivals, right? As well as get party discipline, right? And we see where that's going. I have to other, right? I can't exist, right, without othering people, right? That creates the tension, that creates the drama, that creates the rationale for the oppression. And we have othering at the border, right? We have the othering of African Americans and people of color. I said this earlier, we have to sanction private violence, right? And we don't yet have the brown shirts, right? But imagine, in the consolidation of the power, the sort of infrastructure that's necessary. I said racism needs infrastructure. That has not been built yet, although signals have been clearly granted that there aren't any repercussions for engaging in racialized violence or violence against political opponents. And autocratic states need constant fear, right? Constant emergencies, right? So it can't be stable, right? It can't be normal, right? And we see the sort of creation of that mindset, and that is a real thing. So bottom line is we can find out what authoritarianism looks like. We can apply it to our own lived experience, right? We can understand our present moment. We can educate friends and families, right? And then we can act, right? So again, we want knowledge to enable strategic action, right? We want knowledge to enable strategic action, right? So we got to educate ourselves. And at the Key Center, we will be doing that, educating folks about what authoritarianism is and how that helps us better understand and define the moment in which we live. Time is going fast. This was launched over the weekend, right? As a collaboration, all the work didn't happen, but the actual culmination of the work was at the weekend. And it's in a collaboration with Johns Hopkins Political Science Department. And it's sort of designed to focus on Detroit and Baltimore. And it's called the Beacon Project. And it's a crowdsourcing tool, right? So we don't know really what's happening. And that gives gives individuals and citizens no power, right? And it gives oppressors power, right? So what this does is enables anybody to go to the site right? It's anonymous, right? Unless you want to provide information for limited purposes. And you have a chance to report what impacts you have observed in Detroit, right? And we expand that to Metro Detroit. In Detroit, into Metro Detroit, in Baltimore, as a result of the new policies. Right? So we want to capture what's happening on DEI, right, in the schools. Right? We want to know what's happening with NIH funding. Right? We want to know what's taking place across the full range of spending cuts and spending freezes. Right? And then we have the ability to aggregate that, to look at patterns, right, and have this grow over time. So this is incredibly important. This is something that you can participate in. Right? And I will go back to the people who have the emails and give you the actual sort of bundle of information materials that you could disseminate and then share out. Crowdsourcing only works if there's a crowd, right? And so we really have to build that out, right? But this also gives people something to do, right? Especially if they've been impacted and affected. And it lets us then start to tell the story, factual story, evidence-based story, backed by expertise, right? About what's actually taking place, right? And that's what we've got to do everywhere, right? So there's also something that can be transplanted, right? We can share the technology, we can share the forms, but we got to learn what's happening, right? And that is one of the things that we're trying to do at the Keith Center, right? So what can people do? Education is key, right? Remember talking about seeing, right? Racist systems exist when people don't understand, right? When people don't see it, right? And so we have to educate ourselves about the current historical moment. We have to link that historical moment to a whole pattern of backlash against racial progress in this country, and we have to call things by their true names, right? We have to document what's happening locally, right? And that's what we're trying to do with the Beacon progress, right? We have to engage politically. You could register at Indivisible, right? And be part of a national campaign that's going to call your congressperson, right? Speak out, right? While we still have a chance to have people acting as congressmen and congresswomen. We have to really interrogate what bystander responsibility means, right? That's going to be a huge issue, especially in white communities, right? What obligations do you have as a bystander when you're not targeted yet, but you see other people clearly being targeted? We have to invest in institutions, right? Whether it's a local newspaper, right? Whether it's an organization like this, whether it's your local government. We have to maintain social norms, right, of civility, of decency, of honesty, you know, all the stuff they taught you in kindergarten, right? Those are contested, right? We have to fight for that, right? Because that's one way we create the sort of democratic society we want. And has anybody heard of Timothy Snyder, right? What's his very first rule? Don't obey in advance, right? So, you know, if need be, get ready to lobby the Wayne State Board of Governors, right? Other universities, right? That they don't back, right, and start conceding on these issues until they are forced to concede, right? If we give in advance, right, we're already oppressed, right? Hope, right? It's been bad before, right? And I kind of go back to people like Judge Keith, right? Who lived through oppression himself, right? Who lived through tremendous discrimination, and they made a way out of no way, right? So we also got to know who our elders are, right? We got to know the communities that have the knowledge of resistance, right? We have another project called the Conductor Program, right? And it's how do you build an underground railroad for democracy in Detroit, right? We got to lean into some of that knowledge and wisdom. The Underground Railroad itself is an amazing, subversive, right, under the radar screen institution, right? And hopefully we don't have to get that far, but we have to do some scenario planning, right? How do we look at the worst case scenario, and what are you and your community going to do if that happens,